Yeah, of course. Help yourself.
I did a lot about Public Theology.
Well, a very warm welcome to Birmingham Cathedral for this annual Bishop Gore Lecture on Christian social theology. This year I'm very delighted to welcome Dr Chris Shannahan, who's going to be talking to us. The theme is Life on the Breadline, Theology, Mission and the Scandal of Systemic Poverty, which is probably written behind me so you can read that more easily. This cathedral knows very deeply the realities of poverty by being rooted in the city, by having our doors open every day of the year, by being custodians of the one large green space in the city centre. And one feature for us is working with a couple of partner charities. We're involved in feeding over 250 people each week, offering showers as well, befriending people and dignity. But as importantly as feeding people, there's the tough work of working out how we make a difference, how we work to end the poverty that stunts and distorts our sisters and brothers, people who bear the likeness and image of Christ within them. And tonight's lecture is part of an ongoing piece of work with a particular focus actually on child poverty, which is such an important thing for our city at the moment, with 48% of children in Birmingham living in poverty. Just to advertise something coming up, on Thursday the 5th of February in the morning, there will be a gathering here to listen to good practice from a number of churches in Erdington, stories which aren't normally told about what different churches are doing to work on poverty. There'll be more advertising coming out for that, and if you booked a ticket, I'll make sure the email goes to you via Eventbrite. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin for those in the cathedral. If you need the toilet or the facilities, they're through the door over behind you there by the tea and coffee. There's an accessible one on this floor, or other ones are down the stairs. If an alarm goes off, we're not expecting a fire, it's not a practice. So Steve and myself will appear at the doors over there and escort you out to the Burnaby Monument, which is over there, until it's safe to come back in. It's good as well to be joined by those online, and welcome to you. As a way of trying to involve people who are online as well, when it comes to questions, you can email them in to questions@birminghamcathedral.com, questions@birminghamcathedral.com. If you're in the cathedral, you can stick your hand up, and we'll do that. But it's just for those who are online, and I'll repeat that when it comes to the questions time, questions@birminghamcathedral.com. So I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Chris, and I'll go and sit where I can push the buttons when you need me to.
Thank you, Andy, and good evening, everybody. It's a real joy to be working in collaboration with Andy and colleagues at the Cathedral. We've been talking together for about the last 12 months or so about how we can together build on some of the things that we learned during a recent research project that I led entitled Life on the Breadline, which I'll say a little bit about this evening. We held a conference back in May to begin that collaboration. We're working together this evening, and I'm delighted to give this Gore Lecture. And we're going to hopefully continue to work together, particularly with a focus on the implications of our research for the ways in which the cathedral engages with child poverty. But this evening I want to draw on a number of threads that emerged from our Life on the Breadline research. And so Andy is going to press the buttons for us so that I'm not running backwards and forwards. If we could, that's great, Andy, thanks. I want to do 6 things, and then we can have a conversation together. Firstly, I want to say a word or two about what I'm calling the scandal of poverty. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about what implications that might have for what we could call faith in the public sphere. I want to then say a word or two, just briefly summarizing Life on the Breadline and the Christian responses, number 4, that we identified during that research, Christian responses to what I've referred to as austerity poverty. And then 5th, I want to just touch on some of the things that I've written in a book, Life on the Breadline, that is due to be published by SCM in November, beginning to sow the seeds of what I hope might take the shape of an austerity age theology of liberation. And then finally saying, well, it's all very good to stand at the front and spout and wag your finger, Chris, but what are we going to do about it? So 1 or 2 thoughts briefly to close about action. So if we could move on to the next slide. And this slide, I'm going to just, and one more please, Andy, thank you. This is the context within which we're talking. And I want to just leave that slide there for a moment. We're aware of the ways in which austerity has torn apart the social fabric of Breadline Britain. Breadline Britain in 2025. Thanks, Andy. And it's against that backdrop that I want to reflect together on a number of, firstly, characteristics of poverty. The first thing I want to suggest is that poverty needs to be seen as a form of violence, of death-dealing damage. Secondly, in a few moments, I want to suggest that too often, whether it's preachers or politicians or academics, we think about poverty in one-dimensional terms. We think food bank and not much more. I want to suggest that poverty needs to be seen as something that is multidimensional. And then thirdly, I want to have an argument with the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, and suggest that in spite of what he and his friend David Cameron suggested, poverty is not the fault of feckless individuals, it is systemic. So firstly, poverty as a form of violence. The journalist Nick Davis compared poverty to an assassin. He suggested that the violence that we see when poverty damages communities is often unseen. It kills, says Davis, with stealth. The environmentalist Rob Dixon referred to what he called the slow violence of poverty. Slow and attritional and traumatizing. One of our case studies was of the housing injustice that led to the Grenfell Tower fire and faith responses to that. The levels of PTSD, the levels of trauma that arose from the fire and the homelessness of people for months and years following the fire can be seen as a form of traumatic violence. And I would go further and agree with the the great and sadly late Kenneth Leach, who talked about the ways in which poverty can destroy the soul. Poverty can suck the life out of us, leaving an emptiness where life once lived. We can talk, therefore, about the epistemic violence of poverty, the ways in which narratives of stigma were used to elicit shame on the part of people with direct experience of poverty. That whole notion of what became described as poverty porn, shameless on the TV. That family living it large, we were told, on benefits for years. Then the Benefit Street documentary set here in Birmingham. Again, you're lazy, you're good for nothing, you smoke your benefits, it's all your fault. That notion of the epistemic violence of poverty. And then finally, before we move on, I think it's helpful for people of faith and theologians like myself to be humble enough to learn from people from other disciplines. There's a guy called Johann Galtung, who's the pioneer of peace studies. And Galtung, talking about violence, said we need to think about violence in three forms. He called it the triad of violence. He spoke about direct violence. That can be physical, that can be psychological, that can be verbal, but it's person to person. He spoke about cultural violence. He spoke about flags and hymns and national anthems, the ways in which different forms of culture, not least those flags of St. George that are littering our cities at the moment, can be used to justify and even naturalize injustice. Great example would be that children's hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful. You remember it? Well, you probably don't, please God, sing the following verse. The rich man in his castle, you know where I'm going. The poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estates. We would have sung that in the 19th century, a form of cultural violence. Structural violence, says Galtung, is the way in which damage is built into the system, into policies, into practice, into institutions. So let's move on, shall we, and think about poverty in these terms. Ideas that were picked up by some of the pioneers of Latin American liberation theology. Old quotes, but good quotes nevertheless. Gustavo Gutierrez says, material poverty is a subhuman condition. To be poor means to be exploited by others, not to know you're a person. Elsa Tamez, the New Testament scholar, suggested that poverty causes a degradation of the human being and a seizure of the divine image within the person. Let's move on because we'll share the PowerPoint slides online and by email. So poverty is violent, but I also want to suggest that poverty is multidimensional. We can think of the ways in which food poverty and fuel poverty and poor housing and low pay and personal debt and insecure employment clash and collide and compound one another. With the best will in the world, the food banks up and down the country that do amazing work, perhaps we're missing the point. If I give you a food parcel, you might say, thanks very much, Chris, but I live in bed and breakfast. I can't cook the beans that you gave me because I ain't got a cooker. Or I can't cook because I can't afford to pay the gas bill. Or I spend all my money heating the house because it's damp. We need to think about the whole picture, it seems to me. And thankfully, Organisations like the Trussell Trust are increasingly thinking in multidimensional terms and thinking now of a society without a need for food banks. A big change. Thanks, Andy, if we can move on. So poverty is multidimensional, it's violent, but, and I promise this is the only fancy academic jargony word I'll throw in this evening, I want to suggest that poverty is also something that we experience in an intersectional way. What do I mean by that? I mean that the way we look, the way we speak, where we live, whether we're male, female, young, old, black, white, impacts on our experience of life. Regardless of what George Osborne might have said about us all being in this together, that was never, ever, ever, ever true. Survey after survey, study after study showed very clearly that during the so-called age of austerity, it was those who were already left out and left behind who were hit harder than people that look and sound like me. Kimberly Crenshaw wrote and studied the experience of African American women, their experience of sexism and racism and poverty, and talking about the multidimensional nature of their experience. She suggests in that light that intersectionality is a metaphor for the ways in which multiple forms of inequality combine and compound themselves. That's what we face, but we don't all face it in the same way or to the same degree. So if we can move on, please, Andy. We've talked a bit about the nature of this scandalous poverty that we see. I want to say a word or two now about that great hero of mine, Norman Tebbit. Norman Tebbit was wrong. Back in 1981, Norman Tebbit talked about his dad at the Conservative Party conference. His dad said Norman Tebbit was unemployed during the Great Depression, but, said Norman, he didn't moan or groan. He got on his bike and he cycled around until he found work. Fast forward to 2012, the Welfare Reform Act, George Osborne began to talk about some people, some of our sisters and brothers, as strivers and some as skivers. But to be fair to George Osborne, and that's not a sentence I would say very often, he and Norman Tebbit were only drawing on a much older history. We need to acknowledge that the church for generations, for centuries, has been on both sides of this argument. Yes, going back to the early years, at least since the Middle Ages, people in English and British churches were encouraged to give alms. But quite quickly, we were beginning to distinguish between the able-bodied and the idle poor. Then fast forward to Elizabethan times and the Poor Law. We began to talk about the deserving and the undeserving poor. I would suggest that the culture, that the deep down unconscious prejudice that we find in those words, the moral judgment, is still infecting elements of the church's life. Not just wider society, but the church. I think if we pretend, and there's a giveaway there in the use of the word pretend, I think if we pretend that we do not make moral distinctions between different people who are experiencing poverty, then we are conning ourselves, because I think we do. And that is something to own and to recognize. But it's not just us. We're part of that wider society that individualizes and moralizes poverty. David Cameron, in the aftermath of the street violence of 2011, just as austerity was beginning to kick in, referred to what he called broken Britain. The rap musician Plan B, in response to David Cameron, said, "There's no such thing as broken Britain. We're just bloody broke in Britain. What needs fixing is the system, not shop windows down in Brixton." Violence, I would suggest, is a form of poverty. Poverty is a form of violence, but we need to recognize that poverty is something that is systemic. It's not about individual fecklessness or poor role models or lack of hard work. It's built into the DNA of neoliberal capitalism. We see the structures of poverty built into policy and practice. And we see that within the church as well as in wider society. Successive popes have begun to talk about poverty not just as a form of structural injustice, but they've talked about the structures of sin. John Paul II referred to the structures of sin. He wasn't quite talking about systemic injustice, but was suggesting that the way we order our society is structurally unjust. And Gustavo Gutierrez referred to that as systemic sin. So let's move on. I think Norman has had more than enough time in the spotlight to begin to talk about faith and the role of faith in the public sphere. For most of the 20th century, most academics, certainly most social scientists, and many, many, many politicians on both sides of the aisle, as it were, assumed that faith was gradually declining and on the way out. Max Weber, back in the dawning of the 20th century, talked about the secularization thesis and suggested that gradually faith would wither away and become a private matter with no public significance. Weber was wrong. Social scientists across the board, with some exceptions, have recognized that those bold claims about the death of religion turned out to be hollow. Now, we've not gone back to some pre-secular age. We're not talking about a revival here. We're talking about what some people have referred to as a post-secular society, where we see faith groups who have previously, phrased there from the pioneer of black theology in the UK, Robert Beckford, faith groups, particularly he was talking there about Pentecostal churches who were in the city but had been scared out of the inner city, bought out by grants, so not willing to critique government, sold out to what he referred to as a materialistic kind of faith. But what we've seen is that faith groups remain. Faith groups continue to be embedded in communities, particularly socially excluded communities, often where other communities, other institutions, the statutory bodies have retreated. Faith groups, not least the church, have remained. So in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash, as the state withdrew and as austerity measures kicked in, the question that the church had to face, the church still has to face, is we've got masses of influence, relationships, social capital, if you will. What do we do with our presence? What do we do with that presence? Do we use our social capital to build bridges, kind of a dialogical form of social capital, or do we kind of use our what's called linking capital to connect in with other groups who are campaigning for structural justice and structural change? Shall we move on, please, Andy, to see if we can answer that question before we come to life on the breadline? Sometimes people talk about Matthew 25, Christianity. Feeding, welcoming, clothing the Christ of Matthew 25. But in a structurally unjust society, is it enough to feed, to clothe, to welcome? Does feeding, clothing, and welcoming help the church, enable the church to live up to what the church itself claims as its calling in the marks of mission to transform the structures of injustice? Does welcoming and clothing enable us to live out God's preferential option for the poor? Is a commitment to the common good good enough in an age of austerity where our commonality and our collective identity as sisters and brothers is continuously questioned? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, murdered by the Nazis in 1945, laid the challenge before the church in Nazi Germany, and I would say it's a challenge still. Bonhoeffer said, is the church called to bandage up the wounds of the broken or to ram a spoke into the wheel of injustice? A question we still face, and I'm not sure whether we've found a satisfactory answer. But are we too afraid to move from Matthew 25, from charity, from welfare to politics? A number of the people involved, thank you, Andy, in our Life on the Breadline project were deeply committed, but constantly we heard the refrain, but that's politics, that's too partisan. We do what we do as an act of servanthood and loving our neighbour. And that must be honoured and is immensely valuable. But is it sufficient to transform structural injustice? Life on the Breadline was the first major academic theological project to focus on austerity-age poverty. You'll just see some of the information there that just roots our research in field work, which is something, to their shame, that most theologians seem to be allergic to. Most theologians, I think, prefer to live in libraries and are a bit at sea when we're asked to talk to people. It might be quite nice if we flipped that a bit. But shall we move on, Andy? That's just something about the project. And one more, again, please. During Life on the Breadline, we identified from our participants 4 broad and fluid approaches to austerity-age poverty. Now, that is not fixed. The image might look like it's fixed, but those aren't fixed ideal types. It's much better, perhaps, to talk about the ecosystem of Christian responses to poverty. A caring response that envisages the church as a servant community. A campaigning and advocacy approach that sees the church very much as a liberative movement. Self-help and enterprise, supported particularly amongst evangelical and a number of Pentecostal churches, seeing the church as an empowerer and an enabler. And then a community building approach that is very much about embeddedness and rootedness, seeing the church as a companion. And if we can move on, Andy, we've got dub DJs there, but we can come back to dub a little bit later if we've got any time. So briefly, I just want to touch on those 4 approaches. These were approaches that emerged from our 6 case studies, our focus groups, and our interviews with church leaders across the UK. The first, and by far and away the most widely dispersed, and the approach that's most commonly courted by governments of the left and the right, is what you might call the caring response. Absolutely critically important, and maybe sometimes something that people like me dismiss too easily. In an uncaring society, after all, perhaps caring in itself for those who are excluded is a political act, saying that you matter in a society that says you don't matter. That's fairly subversive. So we dismiss this approach at our peril. But it's characterized by food banks and breakfast clubs and warm banks, and focuses very much on notions of the common good, servanthood, and loving our neighbour. Before we move on, there's just one quote from a Baptist leader who spoke to us during Life on the Breadline, summarizes saying, responding to poverty is prioritized as an act of serving others. Campaigning and advocacy are more political and therefore may be seen as too partisan. So if we can move on to campaigning and advocacy, please, Andy. That's the second approach, and is an approach, as we know, that has often been marginalized within the church, often a kind of an irritant on the edges of the institutional church, but is rooted in that prophetic tradition of social criticism. We see it in the work of the Levelers and the Chartists and the Christian Socialists and the work of priests and the emergence of Latin American liberation theology and 100 other places. We see it too in examples in Breadline Britain. Commitment to social justice, trumping welfare, rooted very much in the values of liberation theology, that in a structurally unjust society, a God who creates all people in the divine image necessarily has a preferential option for the poor, not because rich people are wicked and poor people are saints, but because poverty and structural injustice contradict the will and the nature of God. That's what we see here. We see it in the living wage. Thanks, Andy. And if we see it too in housing justice campaigns, we see it in campaigns for a universal basic income. But then moving on swiftly to quite a different approach. The self-help and enterprise approach is quite an individualized approach to poverty, sees the church very much as an empowerer and an equipper. Robert Beckford argues that historically this is the approach to poverty that we've seen evolve within the Black church, rooting itself back to slavery and colonialism. Robert talks about it as the development of what he refers to as a theology of emancipation, going through 4 stages against the backdrop of a Black community that could not rely on the state, that was oppressed by the state. Robert suggests that what emerges within Black Christian communities is a focus on self-reliance. The state won't do it for me, so we need to support one another. That sense of self-reliance and mutual support, Robert suggests, feeds into a theology of aspiration, the notion of the Saturday school as a vehicle out of poverty, that kind of focus. And then during the 80s and into the 90s, that notion of enterprise, the church enabling people to create small businesses, to work their way, to invest their way out of poverty. And this, suggests Robert, is all part of that kind of theology of emancipation. There's more to it than that, but we'll leave it there for now. It's an approach that's most common in evangelical and Pentecostal churches, some evangelical and Pentecostal churches, and places a focus on education and enterprise, and clearly does enable significant numbers of individuals to, in inverted commas, rise out of poverty. But, two big buts. One, there is this kind of very blurry line between this approach and what's referred to as the prosperity gospel. The notion, in a nutshell, that if you're poor, it's because you're a wicked sinner and you're cursed by God. If you're faithful, God will reward you, and hey presto, there's that BMW. I'm being facetious, so forgive me, but in a nutshell, that's the bare bones of this prosperity gospel or it's extreme. Poverty is your fault. You're being shamed and cursed by God. You've done something wrong. Believe enough, have faith enough, and God will bless you physically and economically. But then, as Robert recognizes, whilst this approach does lift individuals out of poverty, it leaves those structures that oppress black communities unchanged. The structural injustice remains untouched. So finally, before we touch on some of the themes that might emerge in an austerity age of liberation, let's just talk about the final approach. It's one that we encountered in a very powerful way here in Birmingham with friends on the Furs and Bromford estate, sometimes referred to as Hodge Hill, an approach that's referred to as community building and is characterized by an incarnational, embedded notion of the church as a companion, walking with people, remaining with people, sitting with people long term, avoiding, says Al Barrett, who the vicar of Hodge Hill and we interviewed, was part of our project, avoiding what Al calls rescuer language, the notion that communities like Hodge Hill need saviours to come from the outside, often top down, to save communities. Instead, this approach to challenging poverty is built very much on an ecclesiology of solidarity, of growing, loving community, Hodge Hill's watchwords. So we'll move on from community building, if we can, please, Andy. So those are the four approaches, broad approaches that we identified, thanks, one more, please, during Life on the Breadline. That's something about the nature of poverty, something about the nature of the church's role in the public sphere in an age of austerity, something about our Life on the Breadline research, and the four broad approaches to poverty that we identified. Out of all of that, I want to spend a few minutes now just suggesting 5 or 6 steps that we need to take, 5 or 6 reflections that emerge from our research that might help us to begin to develop an austerity age theology of liberation, which I passionately believe we desperately need. So firstly, a very serious and significant commitment to God's preferential option for the poor. A statement, a phrase first used back in 1968 by Catholic bishops in Medellin. We see it built into the witness of the prophets, the ministry of Jesus. Gustavo Gutierrez summarizes it very well. The poor deserve preference, he says, not because they're morally or religiously better than others, but because God is God, in whose eyes the last are first. And for Elsa Tamez again, God identifies himself with the poor to such an extent that their rights become the rights of God himself. So what's it mean to reimagine this preferential option for the poor, as I believe we must in a 21st century context? Or perhaps if we move on to the next slide in step 2, we can begin to think about what that might mean. So the second thing I would suggest is we need to think about incarnation as solidarity. We need to think about that phrase in John 1:14, the word becomes flesh and lives among us, as the most radical example of God's solidarity with oppressed humanity that we're ever going to see. The Anglican theologian Laurie Green talks about Jesus as an organic intellectual, somebody committed to the struggle for God's kingdom, who didn't do so, I'm looking for a pulpit, didn't do so from a 6-foot-high pulpit or from a distance, but rolled up his sleeves and lived amongst people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to go back to Bonhoeffer, was giving a lecture about Christology not long before the Nazis kicked him out of his job. And in that lecture, in that first lecture, he said, Jesus is only the Christ when he is Christ for me. Jesus is only Christ if he is Christ for me, says Bonhoeffer. I want to suggest that Jesus is the child at the food bank, or he is not Christ in 2025. That's incarnational solidarity. That's an expression of God's preferential option for the poor. And if we can move on to step 3, please. We've gone on from the preferential option for the poor to the notion of incarnation as solidarity. But point 3, we need to slow down. There is a tendency, I think, within many churches, amongst many theologians, to rush from Good Friday to Easter Day, and we forget the harrowing of hell. We forget Holy Saturday. We forget pain and anger and angst and lament. We want the happy ending. We want liberation to triumph over oppression. We want resurrection to triumph over crucifixion. But lament and anger and pain and trauma are all too messy. If we want to be taken seriously as people of faith, as communities of faith, as theologians who are people of faith, we need to recognize the mess and the contradiction and the anger and the pain, and not try to smooth it away or spiritualize it into something that it's not. There is that great tradition, isn't there, within the Psalms, of shaking our fists at God. Let's not be afraid to grab hold of that tradition of lament. Thanks, Andy. Let's shake our fists as we think about incarnational solidarity and God's preferential option for the poor. And then let's make sure that we all watch Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse is not a word that I tend to use a great deal, but I would suggest that it can come to our aid. That theme of apocalypse can come to our aid as we think about poverty, liberation, and the gospel, and the scandal of poverty, not least child poverty in cities like Birmingham. So we're not talking about the end times. We're talking about the notion of apocalypse, referring to the unmasking, the revealing of that which is hidden, the democratizing of the knowledge of those sacred mysteries. I would suggest that if we can grab hold of this alternative understanding of apocalypse as a way of unmasking ideology, as a way of revealing the damage of the false consciousness that cultural violence creates and that the myths of austerity create, we can begin to wake up. We can begin to become conscious, as Paulo Freire, one of the proto-liberation theologians, suggested, and move from structural injustice to unmasking, to waking up, to transforming, to dubbing our practice so that it is emancipatory and enables us to develop a kind of a liberative way of living. And so if we can move on to step 5, we might, as we come towards the end of the reflections I want to share, think a little bit about where that takes us. I would suggest that often, maybe too often, when we're thinking about poverty, we're thinking about economic injustice, we're thinking about liberation and oppression, we're thinking about the collective, we're thinking about the politics, we're thinking about the economics, we're thinking about what you might call external liberation. I want to suggest, drawing on that Hebrew notion of shalom, which isn't just peace, it's wholeness, it's justice, it's peacefulness, it's peaceableness, it's peaceful relations, that we need to develop a holistic understanding of liberation. It's no good, absolutely no good, coming up with the most amazing policies. It's no good introducing a universal basic income if we don't change people's hearts. Until poverty and structural injustice become morally unacceptable, we can change whatever policies we like, but ultimately the festering of injustice will remain. The sense that some people deserve it will remain. We need existential as well as economic liberation if we're going to be truly emancipated. Thank you, Andy. If we can just move on to this notion of the common good. The common good lies at the heart of most Christian responses to poverty. But I want to suggest that we need to go a step further. Think back to the Beatitudes. Think about the ways in which Jesus overturned unjust power relations, subverted what was considered to be the common good. I want to argue that what we need to be doing is acting like dub DJs who strip away the layers of a piece of music, strip away the vocals and the keyboards and the guitars, take a track back to its rhythmic foundations and then begin to build a new piece of music on top of the foundations of the old track. We need to strip away the layers if we're going to get back to a transformative use of our linking capital that enables people to overturn, not just survive, but to overturn unjust relationships and social relations. We need a new set of breadline beatitudes, if you like, that are rooted in our life and our communities. And if we could move on, please. So step 7, the final step that I want to just share with you very briefly this evening, is the question, well, what's all of this mean for the church? What kind of church are we talking about? Well, one of the things that we encountered during life on the Breadline was a deeply caring and involved church, by and large. Deeply caring, deeply supportive. 2/3 of the food banks across the UK are rooted and based in churches. There is an honourable tradition. And yet, many of the church leaders across denominations, across theologies, across the UK that spoke to us during Life on the Breadline suggested that the church cares, but is too disengaged. Not disengaged theologically, but physically removed from the brutal, visceral, raw realities of everyday austerity. Because most congregations, church leaders suggested to us, tend to be more affluent than many of the communities that they are seeking to serve. I know before you jump up and down that there are exceptions, absolutely. But that was the feeling of most church leaders, caring but disengaged. And if the church is caring but disengaged, are we part of the problem or part of the solution? Can an institutional church, one arm of which sits, with great respect to my colleagues in the Church of England, in the House of Lords, if we're that embedded in the institution, can we seriously transform and subvert the institution? Do we really have the guts to bite the hand that feeds? Are we prepared to become yeast, unseen and transformative? Or do we want to continue to be mustard seeds that grow and get bigger and bigger? Are we ready? Are we ready to become those subversive communities of faith that seek to live out the liberative gospel of Jesus? Are we ready to meet this Kairos moment? Are we ready, one more please, to face the challenges that are before us? Here are just 5. Are we ready to seriously assert a clear commitment to God's preferential option for the poor? Are we ready to grapple seriously with the implications of the institutional church being largely disengaged from the raw realities of austerity? Are we able to translate the values of community building into an approach to social justice that transforms structural injustice? Are we ready and willing to see the power of liturgy and prayer and sermon and worship and Bible study as vehicles of liberation? Do we address these kinds of questions in the hymns we sing, in the sermons we preach and listen to, in our intercessory prayers, in our Bible studies, our Lent groups, and so on and so forth? There is power in our worship. We know that. Are we ready to use that power to build a new, liberative, emancipated consciousness? Are we ready? Thanks, Andy. Are we ready to face this Kairos moment? We stand at a watershed moment. The church has committed itself to transform structural injustice. Are we ready to take the next step and put that into practice? Thank you very much. And before I stop talking, I promise I will, a number of the things that I've been talking about today have found their way into my new book, Life on the Breadline. There were some flyers over by the coffee bar. It's to be published by SCM in November. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And if anybody would like the slides, if you email inquiries at birminghamcathedral.com, inquiries at birminghamcathedral.com, or get that address via the website, we can let you have those. Now, we've got a little bit of time for questions and discussion. If you're watching online and you want to submit questions, you can do that via questions@birminghamcathedral.com, and my glamorous assistant will pass them to me. But do we have any questions? Anybody who's in the cathedral wants to start off with?
How much do you think that some of the systemic systems actually cause, because people tend to think in a binary system? We think about the rich, we think about the poor, but there are what was described by no one said as the nearly poor. The ones who work and get some benefits, but they can't work more because it affects the benefits. But they still have to pay the bus fares that have just gone up. And they may get some help with things like dentistry and things, but they may not if they earn that bit too much. And it's some of the way the institutions think, is they can't think of this sort of spectrum rather than the binary. The poor are easy, the rich are easy. The bit that are just off the bottom, that get knocked out of everything, don't exist.
I agree with you 100%. Absolutely. We like simplicity. Most of us like simplicity. We like easy answers. We like things that we can kind of communicate in an elevator pitch, as a kind of elevator pitch, kind of a quick, easy answer, quick, easy fix. But you're absolutely right. An example would be in relation to free school meals. I think legislation has changed recently, so I might be ever so slightly out of date, but until very, very recently at least, you had to be earning no more than £7,000 a year for your children to qualify for free school meals. Think about that for a moment. £7,000 a year. Above that, of course, you're still struggling, but you were no longer eligible for your children to have free school meals. That's just one example of the way in which we think in terms of binaries, and lots of people get lost in the cracks. I mean, I could ramble on, but I'm just agreeing with you. But I do think that part of the reason for the binary is a kind of an intellectual or even a theological one. We think of that those historic terms, those who are deserving and those who are undeserving. We think about categorizing people. And we categorize, don't we, very often, because it becomes easier to manage complexity if we categorize stuff. And I think we do that with people. And I think too often we try and fit people into boxes, recognizing that actually lots and lots of people don't fit in the boxes. So I agree with you 100%.
So I'll work my way back, but start here.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a very interesting talk. In terms of structural violence and systematic violence, how much is the church actually part of the system that creates the violence? I think particularly of the fact that within Jesus putting the challenge to the rich young man of selling everything and giving it to the poor, what does that say to the church commissioners that have a fund of over £11 billion?
Now, before I answer, I've got to kind of say, I'm not a member of the Church of England. No. You know the way when sometimes people say, ask you for directions, and you kind of say, well, I wouldn't start from here. And this isn't a cop-out, but we are where we are. And that's not a justification for the siding of the church with wealth for millennia. That's not a justification for kind of Constantine is converted, sees the light, empire becomes Christian, we get Christendom, and we get the kind of symbiotic relationship between church and power. And that is ingrained. That is ingrained, and it has benefited, let's be honest, institutional churches, some institutional churches. It's excluded others, but it's benefited some institutional churches no end in terms of power, in terms of influence, in terms of sitting at the heart of the system of government, in terms of wealth. Absolutely. I think the bottom line is that the amount of money, take the church commissioners as one example, the amount of money that the church commissioners are stewards of, and possibly smaller amounts in other denominations as well, is huge. Is absolutely huge. And the a radical rethinking, a genuinely radical rethinking of the ways in which the churches use their institutional and financial muscle is long overdue. 100% it's long overdue. And I would be joining you, I suspect, in calling for such a liberative change. And I'm by nature an optimist, but my sense is, what's that Malcolm X quote? The powerful have never given up power voluntarily. I can't see a huge change, huge enough to transform wealthy institutional churches, not local parish churches, I get that, absolutely, but wealthy institutional churches into servant communities. Pope Francis, genuinely, I believe, sincerely talked about the need to become a church of and for the poor. He meant it. It's challenging, however, to take that seriously when we think about the global wealth of the Roman Catholic community. Final thing I would say is, because I'm kind of running out of words on that one other than agreeing with you, goes back to this notion of meaning it. I think that we could introduce as many economic transformations as you like. But until and unless we shift that culture that blames people for being poor, that says you deserve it, that we individualize and moralize it, until we in our hearts, genuinely in our hearts, accept that notion that God has a preferential option for the poor and a structurally unjust society is an offense to God, until we genuinely accept that, we can rearrange the deck chairs, but are we doing all that we need to? I'm struggling slightly, but is that okay? It's going to have to be, because I run out of words.
And we've got the contradictions of talking about this in an Anglican cathedral, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely,
Always fascinating. A bijou Anglican cathedral, because Bishop Gore, when the diocese was started in 1905, said, and I suspect having a stern stare in the direction of Liverpool, we're not building a big new cathedral, we'll spend the money on poor relief, which is a good foundation to be on, which we've not always lived up to at all, but hopefully in that direction a bit. But, you know, it's a building in which the Magnificat is prayed every day. So
I remember, talking of the Magnificat, I remember donkeys years ago, I was a Methodist minister in Tower Hamlets in the East End of London. And it was just as, if you've ever watched EastEnders on the telly, it's that kind of loop in the river. What we used to call the Isle of Dogs, but then became known as Docklands. And just as Canary Wharf was being built and the old houses and flats were being knocked down, we were having an Advent group and we talked about the Magnificat. And there were two women in the Bible study, very, very faithful women, very different experiences of life. One was a cleaner in Canary Wharf and the other was a senior executive in Canary Wharf. The senior executive suggested that we need to think about the Magnificat in spiritual terms. Her cleaner disagreed. Leave it at that.
And context matters so much. I remember one of the most profound things in my ministry is had a few years working with a congregation that was made up of women and children recovering from domestic abuse. Yeah. And I remember slightly naively once coming to them with the Beatitudes, and they looked at them and looked at me, and then they said, Jesus is talking rubbish. Yeah. You know, we're not blessed. So anyway, we're sorry, back to questions as I'm hugging them. We had a couple, do we have a couple more here? So if we take these two and then we can try and answer them.
I really enjoyed what you said about being the spoke, not just the bandage. But I wanted to ask, first of all, what influence could the church have over the government, especially when I live in an area that is being gentrified by the government right now, and we are being forced out of our homes? And second thing was, I have lived in abject poverty. I am now out the other side.
Yeah.
But whilst I was going through it, I didn't hear of any church groups. I didn't hear of any help in that sort of way. What would you recommend outreach into communities who really need that help?
Then
Thank you.
Sam, do you want to say yours as well?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the common good, because you not lumped in the common good, but you categorised it under neighbourliness and sort of love of neighbour and caring. I feel that especially in kind of recent Catholic teaching, the common good has intensified into a demand from the popes that people in power share housing and food and things. So I just wanted to ask about what you thought about the common good a bit more.
Yes, you're right. What can the church do? First of all, then the notion of outreach, then the common good, and then maybe tomorrow morning we'll talk about something else. In all seriousness, I think there are a couple of things I would say about the church. There are lots and lots of other things we could say, but in brief, I think we need to be pragmatic and recognise, whilst I'll hold my hands up and say, personally, I do not think that we should have any individual Christian denomination should be tied to the state. That's my personal perspective, and it's a deeply held belief. But I'm not a fool. We are where we are. And for all its faults, the establishment of the Church of England does mean that the Church of England has a route into power, political power, that other denominations don't have. How it uses it is another question altogether, but it does have that route. So one of the people that spoke to us during our research was Paul Butler, the Bishop of Durham, and he held a brief in the House of Lords to talk about universal credit and wealth and the former government's welfare reforms. So I think there is that's the first thing. I think that those Christian leaders with significant power, those Christian leaders who are part of the establishment, whether they pretend they are or not is another matter, but let's be honest, they are. What do they do with their power is the question. There can be a level of influence. I think we need to kind of have a bit of a reality check, though. How seriously would a Margaret Thatcher or a David Cameron or a Keir Starmer or whoever listen to the Bishop of X? They might not, but there's an approach, isn't there, to grassroots politics that's referred to as community organising. It's that notion of the together we do it better. The idea that on my own, I don't have much power. On your own, you don't have much power. But together, we've got more power. The power of the collective. And so we see in a number of cities up and down the UK, community organising networks of often quite small faith and community organisations banding together to put pressure on those with power. We could say more, but that's just one thing. In terms of outreach, I'm really sorry that you didn't experience the support of the church in your experience. It's difficult for me as an outsider to say what the church should do, but my hope is that I think one example would be what we got to know of the church in Hodge Hill. And it's not a perfect church, Hodge Hill Church. Of course it's not. But a church that's rooted in its local community, that doesn't buy the "this is an estate from hell" kind of nonsense, but actually tries to engage with local people and say, you are valuable, we are valuable, you are precious, we are precious, and build a sense of community and involvement and mutual support together over time. Now, that's not a slick answer, but I think it is about more than food parcels, however important they may be. It's about much, much, much more than that. I can be given a food parcel and then sent away. I might fill my belly, but my heart might still be aching, because I might feel, rightly or wrongly, as if I've been... It's about building relationships. It's not an easy, slick answer, so forgive me. The common good. No, you're right. I dismissed it slightly a little bit earlier, and I wouldn't roll back completely from what I was saying, because I do think it can be a kind of a get out of jail card. It can be a bit of a vague top-down notion of that's kind of quite apolitical, that all policymakers must value the dignity of individuals, all of the common good, and God's preferential option for the poor. And the work of people like Anna Rowlands in the UK context have absolutely built on the radical implications of a liberative understanding of the common good that we see particularly in the teachings of people like Francis, but not just Francis, other popes as well. But, and I would say this, it's not just a clever soundbite when I say, is the common good good enough? Is Matthew 25 good enough in a society that doesn't value the common good? That's my bugbear. Is the common good political enough to enable the church to transform structural injustice? There's a longer conversation, but that's what I would say for now.
So we've got one question over here. Any more questions?
Thank you. I think the fundamental problem is the language of capitalism reducing human values to one very simple measure. The important thing about Dietrich Bonhoeffer was that one of the things was that he was an existentialist. He dealt with the whole person relating in the moment to the whole of his reality. And obviously some aspects of that reality are spiritual, divine, artistic. And I think that's probably a profitable way of trying to get through all this, which is obviously confusing for us because we are embedded in it. It's washing around us the whole time, and it's difficult to know what to do in any particular moment.
Just as to the first comment you shared, I would agree with you completely. I think in its very DNA, capitalism instrumentalizes individuals. Absolutely. We're turned into units of labor and all that implies. 100% agree with that. I think there are aspects of Christian theology that recognize that. I think aspects of various theologies of liberation have recognized that. I think one of the perhaps mistakes that we may have made, or the traps that we may have fallen into, is rejecting that description of humanity, but then somehow repeating the logic. We criticize the instrumentalization and the objectifying of human beings, but then get drawn into debates whereby, for all sorts of positive motivations, we end up doing exactly the same thing. So that's the first thing I would say. I think, yes, but I think the church sometimes falls into the same trap. In terms of our kind of sense of anthropology, our sense of who we are, our sense of our God-givenness, I absolutely think that we have reduced our humanity to a kind of pale shadow of itself. And we have neglected the spiritual, the creative, the internal, because they're easy to ignore. They're easy to marginalize. And one of the things that different governments are keen on at the moment is to make sure that university academics like me create lots of impact. Impact with a capital I, and their notion of impact is generally stuff that can be measured, and more often than not, stuff that can be measured and have a pound sign next to it as well. Now, I'm being facetious, but only very, very slightly. One of the most interesting things I think I've ever done was a number of years ago, working with friends in Hodge Hill, and a friend of mine, an artist called Muhammad Ali. And we created what we called a graffiti cube. It was it was based on the kind of the Kaaba in Mecca. It's a huge cube that was designed and painted by unemployed young men from the Bromford estate in Hodge Hill. We took that lived on the estate. It gave a sense of real value and purpose and vision and hope to those young men. It lifted the atmosphere on the Hodge Hill, on the Firs and Bromford estate for a period of time. Then we moved it to the University of Birmingham, this very green campus. And as an aside, it was interesting that it had lived in Hodge Hill for like 9 months without being touched. But within about a week of appearing on the campus at the University of Birmingham, it had not very funny, not very clever graffiti on the graffiti art. That was one of the most impactful things I think I've ever done. But it couldn't be quantified. And I think, do you know what I mean? You couldn't, I couldn't submit the graffiti cube in the university's ref submission, because it couldn't be quantified. But to this day, I would argue that it had more impact than a bunch of other stuff that I've done that could be quantified. And that's a long way around, coming back to what you were saying about the arts. We need patience. We need rootedness. And I think one of the problems is if we're on the edge, we need to be drawn in, and we may not have the time to be patient. We want stuff to change. We want to be included. And the kind of society that we're living in doesn't value the time and the rootedness and the openness that is needed to value the artistic and to value the spirit. Maybe it will. I hope it will.
Sorry to leap in at the end. Thank you so much for what you shared. I was very struck by what you said about the church being caring but disengaged. And you've given some very good examples of sort of incarnational ministry in Hodge Hill particularly. But you talked about the large number of churches which are middle class.
Sure.
How do you move those churches from care to engagement? I'm always struck by Gutierrez's phrase about, if you care about the poor, tell me their name.
Yeah.
How do you move a church in that direction? Have you witnessed any examples of that being done effectively?
I think that there are significant numbers of examples. I think we saw it in our research in response to the Grenfell Tower fire, going back to 2017, and literally 100 yards, 200 yards from Grenfell Tower is Notting Hill Methodist Church. And because that church had been rooted in that community for decades, it wasn't surprising that it became the heart and soul of the response to the tragedy of Grenfell Tower. And the reason I mention Grenfell Tower is that very localized example of deeply, deeply valuable caring. I do not want to dismiss the value of caring. I don't think it goes far enough, but we mustn't dismiss its value for hundreds of thousands of people across the UK every single day. But it moved from that kind of emergency response caring of unconditional welcome and support to draw in other faith communities from across, in their case, the borough of Kensington and Chelsea, one of the most unequal patches of land anywhere in the UK. But churches from the wealthier parts of Notting Hill, churches from South Kensington, Sloane Square, were together in recognising the injustice over decades of the council's approach to social housing, the council's approach to housing injustice. And so began to form something of a coalition would be too strong a word, a kind of a network, a loose network of people supporting the work of Notting Hill Methodist Church and also local mosques around Grenfell Tower. That would be one thing. I think the danger, though, was that Notting Hill Methodist Church was the church on the front line. It was the church responding. It was the church that was respected by people who had lived in the tower because it was rooted in North Kensington. But the power within the churches in Kensington and Chelsea lay in South Kensington and the kind of private squares of Notting Hill and Sloane Square. And so the challenge there was to try and begin to develop a conversation whereby there was an opportunity for people with power, if not individually, institutionally, to recognize that possibly unconsciously, possibly against their will, they were colluding with or benefiting from an unjust society. Not as individuals necessarily. I'm not saying that the wealthy person from South Kensington Parish Church was somehow wicked. But there needed to be an opportunity to see the structural injustice within their communities as a contradiction of the gospel. That's a very winding answer, sorry. So there's something about education. I think there's something about the importance of long-term commitment. I think there needs to be a sense of confession. And by confession, I don't necessarily mean individual confession, but a recognition on the part of the church that the way it has deployed its clergy, the way that it has deployed its resources, where it sees its power, is at the very least open to question. Is the church present, actively present, in those socially excluded communities, whether they're rural or urban? Where does the power within the church lie? So there's a need for conversation and education and conversion, I suppose. This could go on a lot longer, but let's stop there for now. Okay.
So I think we're coming to the end.
Yeah, of course.
I suppose just to go away reflecting on what we've learned tonight, remembering that, as Mark says, we've described, we have to transform.
Yeah.
So there's that invitation to join in on that journey of transformation of the world, moving into just thinking about your question about the arts. You know, there's that phrase about knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing, but actually maybe where we need to move to is somewhere where we know the value of everything, but nobody has to know the cost of anything. That might be quite a good place to move to. As part of the ongoing journey, if you'd like to, you're very welcome to join us on Thursday, February the 5th, when we'll be gathering here to listen to good practice from churches in Erdington. That's some of the churches which we don't normally hear the stories of. And I think that getting those stories out that we can hear is a vital thing. And thinking about how, you know, your question about how how we can engage the churches, for example, in this city who don't see child poverty as an issue, when every ward, even Edgbaston, has significant child poverty. Our Gore Lecture next year is going to be in November 2026, on Thursday the 19th. We've booked it already. Thinking about intersectionality, a significant bit of the work of the cathedral is working with people who have had trauma, are in traumatic situations, and thinking through post-traumatic growth. 19th of November is significant because it's 2 days before the pub bombings anniversary, where we always have the service here. And we've got the Reverend Shona Bell from Coromila in Northern Ireland coming to talk to us about lessons from there. Just reflecting on that, if the flags are still a thing then, actually reflecting on that and Northern Ireland, where flags are used to mark territory and to exclude, will be quite an interesting thing. The councillors in Birmingham say report them as fly tipping, and the council will remove. So, sorry, it's me going on. Could I thank Chris? And here's a small
thank you.
thing to say thank you from us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind of you. It's been really good to spend some time with you. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
My church was the one.